The most dangerous form of poverty may have nothing to do with money. In fact, it may appear only after you already have everything. Most people spend their lives believing that dissatisfaction comes from a lack of something. Not enough success. Not enough recognition. Not enough security. Not enough status. We imagine fulfillment as a destination somewhere ahead of us, waiting patiently behind the next promotion, the next achievement, the next milestone. But what if that assumption is completely wrong? What if the feeling of not enough survives abundance? And what if that is the real mystery hidden inside one of the most misunderstood symbols in Journey to the West? Not a character. Not a battle. Not a supernatural power. A system. A realm. An idea. The heavenly court. Most people look at the heavenly court and see perfection. They see authority, order, prestige, and the highest position imaginable. But if we approach Journey to the West as a symbolic map of the human mind rather than a fantasy adventure, a strange question begins to emerge. Why does a realm that appears to possess everything still feel organized around the pursuit of more? That question matters far more than it seems. Because the heavenly court may not be describing heaven at all. It may be describing us. Think about modern life for a moment. Never in human history have so many people had access to so much. More information. More entertainment. More convenience. More opportunities. Yet anxiety continues to rise. Burnout continues to spread. Success often creates new forms of dissatisfaction rather than eliminating old ones. Why? Why does abundance fail to produce contentment? Why does achievement often create a deeper hunger instead of peace? And why do so many people feel unfinished even after accomplishing what they once believed would finally make them happy? Here's the contradiction. We assume desire is created by scarcity. But what if desire is not a response to scarcity at all? What if desire is a machine capable of manufacturing scarcity even in the middle of abundance? Imagine a treasury filled beyond measure. A treasury so full that nothing more could reasonably be added. Yet the owner still feels poor. That is our first memory fragment. The empty treasury. Not because there is nothing inside. Because the feeling of lack exists somewhere else. Now the question becomes even more unsettling. Where exactly is that somewhere else? Buddhist philosophy has wrestled with this question for centuries. Not by asking what people possess, but by asking why possession so rarely resolves suffering. Why the mind can accumulate endlessly while remaining restless. Why external gain and internal fulfillment often move in completely different directions. And this is where the heavenly court begins to transform from a location into a psychological archetype. A symbolic structure built around a single assumption that fulfillment can be acquired. That enough can be reached. That peace exists one step beyond the present moment. But what happens if that assumption itself is the illusion? Consider another image. An endless ladder disappearing into the clouds. Every rung promises completion. Every rung whispers the same message, just one more. That is our second memory fragment. The endless ladder. The tragedy is not that people fail to climb it. The tragedy is that many reach heights they once dreamed about and discover the same hunger waiting there. The same restlessness. The same unfinished feeling. And suddenly the problem no longer belongs to ancient mythology. It belongs to executives, entrepreneurs, influencers, students, parents, and anyone who has ever postponed happiness until some future version of themselves finally arrives. Which leads us to a much larger question. If the deepest suffering is not created by having too little, and if abundance itself cannot cure the feeling of lack, then what exactly is the mind searching for when it keeps asking for more? To move closer to that answer, we need to look at something even more uncomfortable. What if the greatest illusion is not believing that more will make us happy, but believing that desire itself is always telling us the truth? Most people trust their desires automatically. We assume that wanting something means needing it. We assume that if a goal feels important, it must be pointing toward fulfillment. But the symbolic structure of the heavenly court suggests a different possibility. What if desire is not a compass? What if it is an amplifier? An amplifier that can make a small feeling of insufficiency appear enormous. A small insecurity becomes a major ambition. A small fear becomes a lifelong pursuit. A small wound becomes an identity. And the strange thing is that the process often looks like success from the outside. This is where the symbolism begins to deepen. The heavenly court is not merely a representation of power. It is a representation of organized desire. A world arranged around rank, position, legitimacy, and recognition. Not because these things are inherently evil, but because they reveal something fundamental about human nature. Human beings do not merely want resources. They want meaning. They want significance. They want proof that they matter. And when that deeper need becomes confused with status, a subtle transformation occurs. The pursuit never ends. Because status is relative. Meaning is not. Think about the endless ladder again. The reason it never reaches a final rung is not because the ladder is defective. It is because comparison has no finish line. Someone will always have more. More influence. More recognition. More authority. More admiration. The mind that measures itself through comparison is trapped in a game it cannot win. And this creates a contradiction that appears everywhere in modern life. People are more connected than ever, yet many feel unseen. People have more ways to express themselves, yet many struggle with identity. People achieve goals that previous generations could barely imagine, yet dissatisfaction remains stubbornly present. Why? Because external growth and internal development are not the same process. One can expand endlessly while the other remains untouched. This is our next memory fragment. The golden cage. A structure built from success. Comfortable. Impressive. Even beautiful. Yet still a cage. Not because someone locked the door. Because the occupant believes freedom exists one achievement further ahead. Now the symbolic role of the heavenly court becomes even more interesting. It stops representing a place. It starts representing a psychological mechanism. A mechanism that converts uncertainty into ambition. Fear into achievement. Insecurity into hierarchy. And while that mechanism can produce extraordinary accomplishments, it comes with a hidden cost. The more identity becomes attached to achievement, the more fragile identity becomes. Because every achievement eventually becomes normal. Every victory becomes yesterday's news. Every new level becomes the new baseline. What once felt extraordinary slowly becomes expected. And suddenly satisfaction evaporates. Not because anything was lost. Because adaptation quietly erased the feeling of arrival. This is one of the deepest observations in Buddhist psychology. Suffering does not always come from pain. Sometimes it comes from attachment. Attachment to outcomes. Attachment to status. Attachment to identity. Attachment to becoming. And perhaps most dangerously, attachment to the belief that fulfillment belongs somewhere in the future. Notice the reversal. The problem is no longer scarcity. The problem is the relationship to scarcity. Two people can possess the same resources. One feels grateful. The other feels deprived. The external conditions may be identical. The inner reality is completely different. That should force us to ask a larger question. If abundance does not determine contentment, and if desire can manufacture feelings of lack even in moments of success, then perhaps the real conflict was never between having and not having. Perhaps the real conflict exists between awareness and illusion. Which raises an even deeper mystery. If the heavenly court symbolizes a mind organized around desire, then what would a symbolic realm beyond desire actually look like? And more importantly, would the modern mind even recognize it if it saw it? If that symbolic realm beyond desire seems difficult to imagine, there is a reason. Most people have never been taught to question desire itself. They question whether a desire is realistic. They question whether a desire is moral. They question whether a desire is achievable. But they rarely ask a far more dangerous question. What if some desires survive not because they lead to fulfillment, but because they depend on dissatisfaction to stay alive? That possibility changes everything. Because now we are no longer examining success, ambition, or status. We are examining the hidden engine beneath them. The shadow function. The force operating underneath conscious goals. And this is where the symbolism of the heavenly court becomes increasingly unsettling. On the surface, hierarchy appears to be about organization. Beneath the surface, hierarchy often becomes a way of measuring worth. Not actual worth. Perceived worth. The difference is enormous. When status becomes a measurement of value, every comparison becomes existential. Every promotion becomes more than a promotion. Every achievement becomes more than an achievement. Every loss becomes more than a loss. The mind quietly transforms external events into evidence about identity itself. And that transformation carries consequences most people never notice. Consider our next memory fragment. The throne above the clouds. From a distance, it appears majestic, stable, untouchable. Yet symbolically, a throne has a strange weakness. The higher it rises, the more it depends on remaining high. Its power comes from elevation, which means it lives in constant relationship to the possibility of falling. This creates a profound contradiction. The pursuit of security often creates new forms of insecurity. The pursuit of significance often creates fear of insignificance. The pursuit of control often creates fear of losing control. The very thing people seek for protection becomes the source of anxiety. And suddenly the problem has expanded far beyond the individual. This is not merely a personal psychological pattern. It becomes a collective pattern. Groups create hierarchies. Organizations create hierarchies. Institutions create hierarchies. Civilizations create hierarchies. Every system begins with practical purposes. But over time, another force enters the structure. Status. Recognition. Prestige. Symbolic value. And once those forces become dominant, something subtle begins to happen. People stop asking what is true. They start asking what improves position. They stop asking what is meaningful. They start asking what is rewarded. The center of gravity shifts. Not from ignorance to wisdom, but from wisdom to validation. This is where the Buddhist layer becomes much deeper than many people realize. The central issue is not desire alone. The central issue is identification. The moment a person identifies with a role, a title, an image, or a position, suffering acquires a permanent doorway. Because every role changes. Every title disappears. Every image fades. Every position eventually belongs to someone else. Impermanence is not a flaw in the system. Impermanence is the system. Yet the human mind repeatedly behaves as if permanence can be negotiated. As if enough status can freeze change. As if enough success can stop uncertainty. As if enough recognition can stabilize identity. And this may be one of the deepest symbolic warnings hidden inside the heavenly court. The illusion is not merely that more will satisfy us. The illusion is that anything external can permanently define us. That illusion scales upward. From individual lives. To organizations. To entire civilizations. History repeatedly shows societies accumulating wealth, influence, and sophistication while simultaneously becoming more fragile internally. Why? Because external expansion and internal stability are not the same thing. A civilization can grow stronger materially while becoming weaker psychologically. A person can become more successful publicly while becoming more dependent internally. And perhaps that is why abundance alone has never solved the human condition. Not in ancient times. Not in modern times. Not in any era. Which brings us to another memory fragment. The bottomless cup. No matter how much is poured into it, it remains empty. At first glance, it appears to be a problem of quantity. Pour more. Acquire more. Achieve more. Become more. But what if the real problem is the shape of the cup itself? What if the structure of desire is designed to remain unsatisfied? And if that is true, then an even more disturbing contradiction emerges. Perhaps the greatest obstacle to fulfillment is not failure. Perhaps it is the unquestioned belief that fulfillment can be accumulated at all. Because if fulfillment is not something we acquire, then why does nearly every system in human society teach us to chase it as though it were? So what happens if we stop asking how to satisfy desire and start asking a more radical question? What is desire actually trying to protect? That question leads us into the deepest symbolic layer we have encountered so far. Because the heavenly court is not merely a symbol of ambition. It is not merely a symbol of status. It is not even merely a symbol of attachment. At its deepest level, it represents an attempt to create permanence in a reality built upon impermanence. And that changes everything. Suddenly, the core conflict is no longer between abundance and lack. It is between reality and resistance. Between the way things are and the way the ego wishes them to be. This is the revelation that quietly sits beneath the symbolism. Human beings do not suffer only because they want more. They suffer because they want stability in a world that never stops changing. They want certainty in a reality governed by uncertainty. They want lasting identity in a universe where every identity eventually transforms. The heavenly court becomes the archetype of that impulse. The desire to build something high enough, powerful enough, organized enough, and permanent enough to escape the conditions of existence itself. Yet Buddhist philosophy points toward a startling insight. The suffering does not come from change. The suffering comes from resisting change. That is a completely different diagnosis. Most people spend years trying to strengthen the walls around their lives. More money. More influence. More control. More predictability. But what if the walls were never the answer? What if the very act of building them creates a deeper separation from reality? This is where another memory fragment emerges. A palace built on clouds. Magnificent. Radiant. Seemingly eternal. Yet resting upon something that cannot be held. The image is powerful because it exposes a contradiction hidden inside human nature. People often seek permanence through things that are themselves impermanent. They seek security through wealth that can fluctuate. They seek identity through careers that can change. They seek worth through recognition that can disappear. They seek certainty through systems that inevitably evolve. The structure appears solid. The foundation is not. And this insight scales far beyond the individual. Entire institutions often operate according to the same psychological pattern. Not because they are irrational, but because they are human. Organizations seek permanence. Nations seek permanence. Civilizations seek permanence. Every generation believes it has built something lasting. Every generation eventually discovers otherwise. History does not merely record events. History records attachments colliding with impermanence. That collision leaves consequences. Sometimes psychological. Sometimes social. Sometimes spiritual. And those consequences often appear long before people recognize their source. An individual becomes anxious without understanding why. A society becomes restless without understanding why. A culture becomes obsessed with growth without understanding why. The visible symptoms attract attention. The invisible attachment remains hidden. This is the shadow function revealing itself more clearly. The goal was never simply to possess more. The deeper goal was to defend the self against uncertainty. To construct an identity that feels untouchable. To create a version of life immune to loss. But there is a profound irony here. The harder the ego works to eliminate uncertainty, the more sensitive it becomes to uncertainty. The harder it works to secure identity, the more fragile identity becomes. The harder it works to preserve status, the more threatening change appears. The protection mechanism becomes the vulnerability. This is our next memory fragment. The locked treasury. Not empty. Not broken. Not lacking. Locked. Because its owner is afraid of what might happen if the doors are opened. The symbolism is subtle. Sometimes abundance does not create freedom. Sometimes abundance becomes something to defend. And the moment something must constantly be defended, it begins to own the defender. That insight carries enormous implications for modern life. Many people believe their stress comes from pursuing success. But what if much of their stress comes from maintaining success? What if the burden is not acquisition? What if the burden is preservation? And what if entire social systems quietly encourage this cycle? Not because they are malicious. Because they are built upon the same assumptions. The same fears. The same attachments. The same desire to hold on to what cannot ultimately be held. Now the heavenly court starts to look very different. Not as a destination. Not as a reward. Not even as a place. But as a mirror. A symbolic reflection of a mind attempting to negotiate with impermanence. And that realization reveals a mystery far deeper than anything we have explored so far. If the true source of suffering is not desire itself, but the attempt to make temporary things permanent, then what would happen if someone stopped resisting impermanence altogether? Would that person lose everything? Or would they discover something that the entire architecture of status, achievement, and accumulation was never capable of providing in the first place? So what would happen if someone stopped trying to turn temporary things into permanent ones? Not as a theory. Not as a philosophical exercise. But as a fundamental shift in how they relate to life itself. This is where the deepest revelation hidden within the symbolism finally begins to emerge. The opposite of desire is not having less. The opposite of desire is not giving everything away. The opposite of desire is not passivity. The opposite of desire is freedom. Freedom from the illusion that fulfillment exists somewhere outside the present experience of being alive. And that distinction is enormous. Because most people misunderstand attachment. They imagine attachment means loving something too much. But in Buddhist philosophy, attachment is closer to dependence. The belief that I cannot be complete unless this remains exactly as I want it. A relationship. A career. A reputation. A position. An identity. The object changes. The structure remains the same. And that structure is precisely what the heavenly court symbolizes at its deepest level. Not power. Itself. Dependence on power. Not status itself. Dependence on status. Not achievement itself. Dependence on achievement. The symbol is pointing toward a psychological mechanism. A mind that has outsourced its sense of wholeness. This is the core revelation. The real poverty was never material. The real poverty was the inability to experience completeness without conditions. That is why the symbolic conflict has never been about abundance versus scarcity. It has always been about conditional fulfillment versus unconditional fulfillment. One depends on circumstances. The other does not. One constantly negotiates with reality. The other accepts reality. One creates anxiety. The other creates freedom. Now the individual pieces begin to connect. Desire. Attachment. Illusion. Power. Suffering. They are not separate concepts. They are stages of the same process. Desire says, something is missing. Attachment says, I found what will complete me. Illusion says, this can last forever. Power says, I must protect it. Suffering begins the moment reality disagrees. And transformation begins the moment that pattern is seen clearly. This is our next memory fragment. The mirror of the empty throne. A throne stands before us. But when we look closely, nobody is sitting on it. Because the true ruler was never a person. It was a belief. The belief that fulfillment exists somewhere else. The moment that belief loses authority, the throne loses power. That insight extends far beyond personal psychology. Entire economies are built upon dissatisfaction. Entire industries monetize insecurity. Entire cultural narratives encourage people to become someone before they allow themselves to feel complete. Not because anyone is secretly controlling society. Because the same psychological pattern exists collectively. A civilization often reflects the inner condition of the people who create it. When individuals feel incomplete, systems become engines of completion. When individuals fear insignificance, systems become engines of recognition. When individuals fear uncertainty, systems become engines of control. The outer world begins reflecting the inner world. And this creates another profound reversal. Many people believe they are chasing success. But symbolically, they are often chasing relief. Relief from self-doubt. Relief from uncertainty. Relief from feelings they do not fully understand. Success becomes the visible goal. Psychological escape becomes the hidden goal. That is why achievement alone rarely resolves the deeper issue. The achievement was never addressing the real problem. This is our next memory fragment. The traveler carrying gold through a desert. At first glance, the gold appears valuable. But if the traveler is dying of thirst, the gold solves nothing. The problem was misunderstood from the beginning. The solution cannot work because it addresses the wrong need. The same pattern appears throughout modern life. People accumulate experiences, credentials, followers, possessions, accomplishments. Yet many still describe a persistent feeling that something is missing. Not because they failed. Because they succeeded within a framework that never questioned the nature of fulfillment itself. And perhaps that is the deepest symbolic meaning hidden within the heavenly court. The structure is not warning us about ambition. It is warning us about mistaken identity. The confusion of what we have with what we are. The confusion of achievement with awakening. The confusion of recognition with meaning. The confusion of possession with peace. And once that confusion is recognized, another question begins to emerge. A question far larger than personal success or personal happiness. If true freedom comes not from controlling reality but from no longer depending on reality to validate us, then what happens to an individual, a society, or even a civilization when that truth is ignored for generations? If that confusion remains unresolved, the consequences do not stop with a single person. They spread. Quietly at first. Then systematically. Then culturally. Then across entire civilizations. This is the legacy hidden inside the symbolism. Not the legacy of a place. Not the legacy of an institution. The legacy of a pattern. A pattern that continues reproducing itself generation after generation. Because every human being eventually encounters the same question, what am I using to define my worth? And the answer to that question shapes everything that follows. When worth becomes attached to external conditions, life becomes a constant negotiation with uncertainty. The individual feels it as anxiety. Organizations feel it as competition. Societies feel it as endless escalation. Civilizations feel it as perpetual expansion. The scale changes. The structure remains the same. This is why the symbolic meaning of the heavenly court extends far beyond mythology. It represents a recurring tendency within human consciousness itself. The tendency to build identity on foundations that cannot remain stable forever. And when enough people share the same tendency, entire systems begin reflecting it. This is where the consequences become especially important. Not because they are dramatic. Because they are ordinary. The most powerful patterns are often invisible precisely because they feel normal. People become convinced that more productivity will finally create peace. More visibility will finally create confidence. More achievement will finally create fulfillment. More control will finally create security. The goals change. The psychological architecture remains identical. And over time, that architecture leaves a legacy. A culture of comparison. A culture of performance. A culture of perpetual becoming. A culture where people learn how to succeed before they learn how to be. This creates our next memory fragment. The endless construction site. Everywhere there is movement. Everywhere there is improvement. Everywhere there is expansion. Yet nothing is ever truly finished. Because the project is not actually a building. The project is identity itself. An identity built upon external validation can never reach completion. Now the scale expands again. From society to civilization. One of the strangest patterns in history is that periods of extraordinary material advancement often coincide with periods of profound existential uncertainty. At first, this seems contradictory. Should not greater abundance produce greater stability? Should not greater convenience produce greater peace? Should not greater progress produce greater satisfaction? Yet history repeatedly suggests otherwise. Why? Because external development and inner development follow different laws. Technology can solve practical problems. It cannot answer questions of meaning. Economic growth can increase options. It cannot determine purpose. Social recognition can amplify identity. It cannot reveal identity. The tools become more powerful. The fundamental human questions remain. And when those questions remain unanswered, something remarkable happens. People begin treating solutions as substitutes for understanding. They attempt to solve spiritual questions with material answers. Existential questions with professional achievements. Questions of identity with social recognition. Questions of meaning with consumption. The consequence is not merely personal dissatisfaction. The consequence is collective restlessness. A society that keeps moving without understanding what it is moving toward. A civilization that becomes extraordinarily capable while remaining internally uncertain about why capability matters. This is our next memory fragment. The compass that always points forward. No matter where its owner stands, it never points here. It never points now. It never points inward. Only forward. Always forward. The image is haunting because it captures a psychological condition that has become deeply familiar in modern life. Many people spend years preparing to live. Preparing to be happy. Preparing to feel complete. Preparing to arrive. Without ever questioning the assumption that fulfillment exists somewhere else. And perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of all. Not a specific belief. A habit of consciousness. A habit of postponing wholeness. A habit of locating meaning just beyond reach. A habit of treating the present moment as insufficient. Yet there is a final consequence that may be even more significant. The longer this pattern persists, the harder it becomes to recognize it. Because eventually the structure feels natural. Normal. Self-evident. People stop seeing the cage because they were born inside it. Which leads us to a mystery that remains unresolved. If entire individuals, institutions, and civilizations can organize themselves around the pursuit of something that never truly satisfies, then how would anyone recognize the difference between genuine fulfillment and a more sophisticated version of the same illusion? And if such a difference exists, where would we even begin looking for it? Perhaps that is why the deepest symbols are never really about the worlds they appear to describe. They are about the worlds we carry within us. The reason the heavenly court continues to matter is not because it belongs to an ancient story. It matters because the archetype it represents never disappeared. It changes language. It changes clothing. It changes institutions. But it continues appearing wherever human beings search for certainty in what cannot remain certain. And perhaps that is the final insight hidden beneath everything we have explored. The opposite of illusion is not knowledge. The opposite of illusion is seeing. Truly seeing. Seeing the difference between value and validation. Seeing the difference between identity and image. Seeing the difference between fulfillment and distraction. seeing the difference between what supports life and what merely occupies it. The symbolic journey has never been about escaping the world. It has always been about seeing the world clearly enough that it no longer controls us in the same way. Not because circumstances stop changing. Not because uncertainty disappears. Not because desire is permanently erased. But because something more fundamental begins to awaken. An understanding that worth does not need to be earned every day. An understanding that meaning does not depend entirely upon achievement. An understanding that peace is not something added to life after enough conditions are satisfied. It is something obscured by the constant search for conditions. This changes the role of every memory fragment we have encountered. The empty treasury. The endless ladder. The golden cage. The throne above the clouds. The bottomless cup. The palace built on clouds. The locked treasury. The mirror of the empty throne. The traveler carrying gold through a desert. The endless construction site. The compass. That always points forward. None of them are ultimately about wealth, power, status, success, or failure. They are different reflections of the same human tendency. Looking everywhere except the place where the question actually began. And that realization carries a profound spiritual meaning. In Buddhist thought, awakening is often misunderstood as acquiring special wisdom. Yet symbolically, awakening may be closer to releasing a misunderstanding. Not adding something. Seeing through something. Not becoming more. Ceasing to be deceived by the belief that more is always necessary. The transformation is subtle. The world remains the same. Careers still exist. Goals still exist. Responsibilities still exist. Societies still function. Civilizations still rise and fall. But the relationship changes. The mind no longer treats temporary things as the foundation of permanent identity. And when that shift occurs, something remarkable becomes possible. Achievement without dependence. Possession without attachment. Ambition without insecurity. Influence without self-importance. Participation without captivity. The external structure may remain. The internal prison begins to dissolve. That may be the enduring legacy of this archetype. Not a lesson about heaven. A lesson about consciousness. Not a warning against success. A warning against confusing success with completion. Not a rejection of the world. A reminder that the world was never designed to answer questions that belong to the spirit. And perhaps that is why the deepest forms of dissatisfaction often survive accomplishment. Because they were never asking for accomplishment in the first place. They were asking for understanding. For clarity. For freedom from a misunderstanding so old that most people inherit it before they ever learn to question it. In the end, the most mysterious thing may not be why human beings keep searching. The most mysterious thing may be this: if nothing external was ever capable of making us complete, and if the feeling of incompleteness was never what it appeared to be, then when we finally stop running toward the horizon in search of ourselves, what is it that has been quietly waiting here all along?